we won't be singing ourselves. And also, can I ask, I understand that we're still supposed to be wearing masks. And then there'll be Q&A, the opportunity to ask questions, basically by text, although if you're here, you're welcome to ask them out loud as well. But we're going to begin with my friend Rob Smith, who's going to come and sing, and he's got impeccable taste in music. So he's going to sing a Della Mitri song, and if you don't know who Della Mitri are, you should repent immediately, and we will inform you afterwards about the glories of Scottish music.
Thank you, David. When I saw the theme of today, my mind went immediately to the Rolling Stones. Can't get no satisfaction. I thought maybe that's not quite the right song, but then Della Mitri came to mind because they're from Glasgow. This song is a little rocky, but it's a very insightful song about the ways in which, well, all of us, in different ways, to different degrees, try to find solutions to our problems that actually only make the problems worse. So the song called Medicine. You can find another country if you want, somewhere you can hide yourself away. Find yourself another set of holes to haunt. Get yourself another debt that you can pay. Yeah, you can try to run for cover everywhere and add another letter to your name. Burn everything you ever used to wear. Get yourself another lover that looks the same. But sometimes it's the medicine. Sometimes it's the medicine. Sometimes it's the medicine itself that makes the pain. Well, you can always make another move again, another set of keys, a different town, and you can try to lose yourself in them till the truth it catches up and cuts you down. 'Cause sometimes it's the medicine, sometimes it's the medicine, sometimes it's the medicine itself that makes the pain. And you can always hide the tragedy you've come from, but every new disguise is just another lie to run from. And you can only fool yourself so long with any kind of measure you can find, for every phony pleasure you've been on has lifted off and left the pain behind. 'Cause sometimes it's the medicine, sometimes it's the medicine. Yes, sometimes it's the medicine itself that makes the pain. Sometimes it's the medicine, sometimes it's the medicine. Yeah, sometimes it's the medicine itself that makes the pain. Thank you.
Now, you should have one of these leaflets. If you're watching online, we'll put stuff up online as well. You'll see the slides and so on. If you don't have one of these leaflets, George is at the back there, and if you put your hand up, or Jack as well, feel free, and we'll make sure you get one. We are looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to ask Ruth if she'll come and read verses 1 to 11. It's a very, very unusual book in lots of ways, but it's bizarrely, for a book that's thousands of years old, it's incredibly contemporary. So Ruth will come and read verses 1 to 11.
So So verses 1 to 11. I said to myself, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good." But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun.
Do you want to do that? Okay, it's someone's birthday, I think yesterday, and that is a man called Mr. Robert Zimmerman, otherwise known as Bob Dylan. He's 80, which is just incredible. The way that he does some of his songs, I suspect he'll still be able to sing them at 100, but he has one song called Satisfied Mind, which he kind of snarls out. I'm not going to do a Rob Smith and try and sing it to you, but the lyrics are, how many times have you heard someone say, if I had his money, I'd do things my way. But little they know, it's so hard to find one rich man in 10 with a satisfied mind. So we are going to look at wealth. We're going to look at humor. We're going to look at pleasure and architecture and gardening and money and rest and stress and wine, women and song. And we're going to do that for those of you who are working, so we're all done and you're back at work by 1 o'clock. What's the point of pleasure? Laughter, he talks about here, it means superficial fun. A fool finds pleasure in evil conduct, but a man of understanding delights in wisdom. Proverbs 10:23. Even in laughter, the heart may ache, and joy may end in grief. It's quite remarkable when you read biographies of comedians. And by the way, I think stand-up comedians are today's prophets. They get the biggest crowds by far. But it's quite remarkable that when you read biographies of them, so many seem to be depressives as well. The wonderful John Cleese, for example, from Monty Python, or Basil Fawlty, suffers from depression. Stephen Fry, very comic person, very witty person. He was rector of my university in Dundee, and he also suffers from depression. Sometimes at a party, the person who's laughing the most is the person who aches the most, and that's what Solomon is saying here. It's not wrong to have a good laugh, but if you come away still aching. He talks about wine. And the idea here is not so much your drunkard. The idea here is the connoisseur who really enjoys a good wine. I translate that into my culture as a good whiskey. I like whiskey. I confess that. I really do confess it. I do enjoy a good whiskey. And there are times in your life that maybe you are able to afford some of the finer things in life. A good wine. I don't think you'd be quite like the four, as they called themselves, masters of the universe, who went into a restaurant in London and ended up with a bill that meant their whole meal was free because they spent £60,000, that's over $100,000, on wine. I would regard that as quite immoral, to be honest. But Solomon said, wine, The Bible, paradoxically for many people, it challenges drunkenness, but it also says that we thank God for wine that makes glad the heart of a human being. And then he has great projects. They describe some of the, I undertook these great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. So just think of it in terms of Australia. It's as though Solomon, well, he built a house in the eastern suburbs, then one up at the northern beaches. To really get the class area, he goes to Artarmon, and then he decides, I'll just buy a couple of vineyards up in the Hunter Valley, and so on. He does all of this and much, much more. And yet this building was for his own pleasure. It wasn't really for the public good. We know that he built up, we read in one of the books of the Bible, 2 Chronicles, that he built up Tabor in the desert, and he built up store cities. He rebuilt Upper Beth Horon and Lower Beth Horon as fortified cities, and he created lots of cities for his chariots and his horses. And yet it still wasn't enough. Included in this, by the way, gardens. I'm not a gardener. My version of gardening is basically concrete to stop the weeds coming up, but I realize that's wrong. Gardens are beautiful. I love just walking out of here, going up to the Botanic Gardens. Well, Solomon created Botanic Gardens. He would have in mind what we now know as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. These kind of gardens, they were characteristic of royalty and nobility in the ancient Near East. They featured choice plants, they would contain a summer house, they would be walled to ensure privacy, and they would also include things like great public parks. And you'll note the reference to lakes to provide waters for trees. The trees were essential for wood, for ships, musical instruments, and houses. In all of this, there's a sense of grandeur. And I understand that as well, because the Botanic Gardens here for me are just my absolute go-to spot. I speak to some lawyers on a Thursday morning, and it's an early time of morning to be speaking to lawyers, to be honest. And so I just need to recover, and I just head away down. Apologies, George, and to anyone here who's a lawyer. By the way, if you go through this whole thing and you've not been offended, you should be offended. I try to mention everybody equally. But I love when I'm finished. We're up that direction, and when I'm finished, I just love walking down through the Botanic Gardens. And Solomon loved that, and it wasn't enough. And his wealth, all King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. I remember speaking to a friend of mine who was a plumber, and he told me that a big estate in the north of Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, he went in to do some plumbing work, and they searched him before he came out. They put him through a screen detector. I said, why? Well, he said, I was putting washers on taps in the bathroom. He said, why would they search you? He said, they were gold. Gold taps, gold washers. It was owned by some sheik from somewhere. I mean, why do you need a gold tap? I mean, like literally gold, not colored gold, but worth fortunes. Well, there's a sense in which that's what's going on here. Solomon was so prosperous that silver, who cares about silver? It's not worth anything. Again, can I just say, it's a little bit like Australia. I love Australia in lots of ways, but this is one of the richest nations in the world. I heard that apart from Switzerland, the per capita wealth is the highest in the world. Then in verse 8, he talks about women. Now, the term is a disputed one. It could mean cupbearer, but is more likely to mean mistress, lover, or concubine. It could also be quite a crude term that refers to women solely as sexual objects. 1 Kings says this, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. The more things change, the more they say the same. If you are a powerful man with a lot of money, it's amazing how attractive you are to women. If you're just like me, good looking and poor, it doesn't matter. That's the way that people look at things. You know, it's very easy if you've got money. I mean, you look at all these billionaires, and then you look at some of their wives, and you think, oh yeah, would she have married you without the money? I'm sorry I hope you don't consider that a sexist comment, but that's just the reality of the world that we live in, and it has ever been thus. But Solomon said, no, it just wasn't enough. He mentions song. Verse 8, unusually here it's a mixed choir. It seems to have been pretty good, and it was very entertaining. Music has always been important in human culture, and it will continue to be. I cannot think of any culture in which music is not important. And I love the fact that there's a variety of different kinds of music. So we're watching a Netflix program just now called, I can never pronounce it, Scheitzel or something. And it's wonderful. And what I love about it is, in that Orthodox Jewish tradition, the singing, because they're all dressed in black and they sing so joyfully. They really need to be like Scots, who we dress in black and we can sing mournfully as well. But music, whatever your taste, it's very important. And here's his conclusion. He remains objective. He's like the German poet Goethe, who, it said, analyzed his voluptuousness and studied his own faculties of enjoyment. I'm sure there are students who would like to do a PhD in enjoyment. I'm sure there's somewhere you can do that. I'm going to study how much pleasure I can get and analyze. But that's what he did. He says, my heart took delight. There was a sense of achievement. He wasn't saying it was all pointless at one level. In verse 11, it carries the idea of looking someone in the eye. When I surveyed all that my hands had done. He woke up in the morning. He enjoyed his work. He enjoyed his pleasure. But in the cold light of day, when he woke up in the morning, he recognized it was all pretty useless. No good. Pointless. And why was it pointless? If you examine the text from verses 4 to 8, you'll find that the refrain, for myself, is used 6 times. I don't care how wealthy you are. I don't care how talented you are in your gifts. I don't care how many lots of different relationships you may have. But if you live your life for yourself, you will be dissatisfied. That's what Solomon is saying. So the bottom line is that pleasure-seeking does not satisfy the spiritual thirst of the secular person, and therefore it's all pointless. So Solomon says, okay, let's think about this. Let's go and study this. I've tried the pleasure part. I've gone into the pleasure gardens, and so Ruth's going to come and read verses 12 to 16 to see how he got on.
Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die.
Okay. What's the point of thinking? What's better, wisdom or pleasure? Wisdom is the supreme need of the king because he has to govern. Counsel and sound judgment are mine. I have understanding and power. By me kings reign and rulers make laws that are just. By me princes govern and all nobles who rule on earth. Just an aside about politics, I can't resist it, just simply to say that we don't elect politicians because they're good looking or because they can talk. We should elect them because we believe they can rule justly, and to rule justly involves wisdom. So I do feel for our political leaders, and it's why we as Christians pray for our political leaders. No one wants to be a fool. In Proverbs, the fool There's the wise woman, but there's also the foolish woman. And it says, the woman folly is loud. She is undisciplined and without knowledge. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple come in here, she says to those who lack judgment. Stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know that the dead are there, that our guests are in the depths of the grave. And then it talks about being a highway to hell. Always chilled me a little bit that AC/DC, that wonderful Scottish-Australian band, when they're good, they're Scottish, when they're bad, they're Australian. That wonderful band, in one sense, at their concerts, people exalted in singing Highway to Hell. You really don't want to be on a highway to hell. So he goes to study all of this, Solomon, and his answer in verses 13 and 14, it's very nuanced. He says, okay, wisdom is better than folly. Being smart is better than being stupid. Understanding things is better than not understanding things. And wisdom is needed to give strength and success. And wise people walk around with their heads clear and they get on. Stupid people live dumbed-down lives in a dumbed-down culture. And again, just let me throw out something here. One of the things that distresses me about our culture is the extent to which we say, it doesn't matter. Don't bother trying to learn. Don't bother trying to understand. I think that the 21st century will be the Asian Pacific century. And here's one simple reason why. A friend of mine who lectured in Malaysia and in Singapore came back to Scotland, and he told me this. He said, David, in Malaysia, when I lecture students in Scotland, they want to tell me what they know, which is precious little. When I lecture students in Malaysia and Singapore, they want to find out what I know. That's wisdom. Not just telling people what we know, but finding out. But what does he say? Verse 15, he says, what's the point of all this? Because both can't avoid death. The stupid person dies. The wise person dies. And what Solomon is really saying here is, with all my wisdom, with all my thinking, with all my knowledge, if I can't find meaning, then what chance do the rest of us have? And so we give up and we say, look, I tell you what, let's just work. So let's see what he's got to say about that. Again, I'm going to ask Ruth to come and read verses 17 to 23.
So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. Even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
I was hitchhiking in Germany once, and this German gentleman stopped to pick us up. I had a Scottish flag on my pack, and my friend had a British flag, a Union Jack. And we got in the car, and the man said, I'm picking you up because of the Union Jack. So I was a bit disappointed with that one. But he said, I'm picking you up because of the Union Jack. And he said, I love the British. And I said, okay, why do you love the British? And he said, because they're not like the Germans. He said, in Germany, we work until we're 65, and then we retire and we don't know what to do. In Britain, you're just dead lazy. I love that. I think that was probably a bit of a stereotype and not fair. But, you know, there are people who work really, really hard. And you know the old saying that nobody on their deathbed says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. Well, there's a certain degree of truth in that. And what Solomon does here is, he says, death not only destroys wisdom, because what's the point if you're going to die, but death also destroys, casts a shadow over much of life. In actual fact, he says, verse 17, I hated life. I hated life. I had everything, but I hated life. And I hate toil. And here the word is basically the daily grind, the daily responsibilities. He's not only thinking about trying to understand about what it's all about, but he's saying, I work for this, I work for this, I work for this, I get this house, I've got the flat in the city, I've got the house in the suburbs, I've got the 2 cars, I've got the 4 foreign holidays when we're finally allowed to go on foreign holidays. I've got all of that, and then what happens? I will die, my children will take it, and who knows? They may just absolutely waste it all. What have I done working for this? Solomon's own son Rehoboam destroyed much of his father's work in building up the kingdom. It's almost as though Solomon saw this coming. You can work during your life with wisdom and end up leaving it all to a fool. So what's the point of it? And so his heart begins to despair. Verse 20, he says that. My heart began to despair. Because despite wisdom, despite knowledge, despite skill, despite hard work, despite inverted commas being a good person, there's no escaping death, and there's no guaranteeing what comes after. So all hope of a worthwhile life is gone. I bet you're glad you came in here, you know, just to be cheered up on your lunchtime. All hope of a worthwhile life is gone. Wisdom and pleasure have failed. Human endeavor cannot be remembered, retained, or passed on. And it's not just that it's unfair and unjust, because he says, I've got nothing but pain and sleepless nights. You know, I think until 2011, I don't think I'd ever had a sleepless night in my life. I could sleep on a bus standing up, and I often did. I could sleep in lectures, and I often did. You know, just sleep. I didn't realize what a great gift sleep was until about 10 years ago. Suddenly I started having sleepless nights. It's a horrible thing. And so he sums it up in verse 23. You work hard, there's physical labor, there's mental exertion, and then at night when you're supposed to be recharging your batteries, you're so stressed you cannot sleep. I cited it last week. I just love their insight. Abba, I work all night, I work all day to pay the bills I have to pay, but still there never seems to be a single penny left for me. Ain't it sad? Or Doug Copeland, the novelist. As the expression goes, we spend our youth attaining wealth and our wealth attaining youth. I mentioned that in an American church once and spoke about Botox. And afterwards, the pastor said to me, you're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. And I said, what? He said, half my congregation have got Botox. And he said, you were touching a very sore spot in that one. And I said, well, just put me down as stupid. I had no idea that people were doing that. But you can get a lot of money when you're young, and then Copeland's point was you spend it when you're old trying to retain your youth. So how can we be satisfied? The answer is we can't. Not under the sun. Not if there is no God. Not if this life is all there is. But Jesus says this, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. Do you remember those ridiculous adverts? I think it was for Pepsi Max, live life to the max. You drink this sugary drink and suddenly you'll be flying off cliffs. Or, you know, the advert for deodorant, and that if you're a male, that you spray this deodorant and suddenly all these women are just coming running towards you. It's all rubbish. None of it is true. That's just not how life is. But life to the max is this. It's not a life without pain or a life without sorrow, but it's a life with purpose and meaning, even in your sorrow. So let me finish just by saying this, just going back through this list. In terms of pleasure, Jesus is not saying forget pleasure. He's saying who gives pleasure? God. And who perverts it? The devil. So wine is great. Drunkenness, when somebody, to me, this is me being a Scot now, it seems to be an insane waste of money to get drunk on malt whiskey. Just go and get the cheap stuff if you're going to do that. But what a waste. We waste so much that we have been given. But when we come to know Christ, we know how to really enjoy pleasure. Laughter. The Bible's not saying there's no place for laughter. It's the timing and the object of the laughter. It's not mocking other people. Maybe if you are a Christian, one of the things you need to learn is, hey, chill out a wee bit and learn to laugh. Wine. Jesus turned water into wine, the best wine. We have communion with wine. Well, some of us don't have wine. We have grape juice. But originally it was wine. The great projects, the creative and artistic skill, in that we reflect the Maker. We're not saying, hey, listen, all Christians are to be like, East European communists. We just live in blocks. Utilitarian. No. Look at this beautiful building. It's done to the glory of God. Wealth. It's not wrong. I was going to say there's nothing wrong with wealth. It's our attitude to it. We use worldly wealth to gain eternal reward. We work hard to provide for those in need. What about relationships? Proverbs tells us to rejoice with the wife of your youth. Not women as objects, not men as objects, but men and women together as partners, rejoicing in one another and in God. The trouble is our society's view of sex has created a situation whereby we treat one another as objects. Do you know what I think is probably one of the most serious issues facing that the government won't deal with, and that's pornography. The objectification, particularly of women, but also of young people. Song. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We use the gift of music to celebrate the goodness of God and the glory and beauty of his world. Sleep. He gives his beloved sleep. I love the story of Jesus in the storm, and there's this crazy storm, and he's sound asleep. And they wake him up and say, don't you care that we drown? And he basically says, relax, calms the wind and the waves, and now they're terrified. Who is this who even calms the winds and the waves? When you come to believe and trust in Jesus, I'm not saying you'll never have sleepless nights, but I'm saying the reason for having sleepless nights, one of the main reasons, gets taken away. Or work. You work for the glory of God. Everything that you do, you can do for the glory of God. So let me just summarize it this way. I want to suggest that without Christ, everything you do this week, although it may bring temporary pleasure and satisfaction, will ultimately leave you dissatisfied, like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. But with Christ, even the most mundane, boring, and seemingly meaningless task can be transformed into something beautiful. Okay, we're going to take some questions, and you can text them in. That should be up on the screen. And I'll begin with one that's got here, and then we'll see if anyone wants to ask one. How does the parable of the talents address Solomon's despair? The parable of the talents is where Jesus tells a story of a man who gives out talents, money, to people, and one man multiplies it, doubles it, another man has less but doubles it, and the other one only has one and he keeps it and buries it away. I think it addresses this subject by simply saying, to whom much has been given, much will be required. In other words, if God gives you a gift, it is to be used. It's not to be stored away. I would be a horrible, miserable human being if I lived in a place where I had so much food and so much wealth, and I built a wall around my home, and outside there were people who were starving. What kind of human being would I be? It's not wrong to have the wealth, but it's what you use it for. It's not wrong to be gifted, but it's what you use those gifts for. And I just think it's very difficult for human beings who are innately selfish. I'm very selfish. I think I'm the center of the universe. And so do all of us. We all react in that way. And it's just very hard for us to overcome that. But when we see a greater purpose in life than even ourselves, it actually enables us to live life much more fully. There's an old saying about, oh, you Christians, you just pie in the sky when you die. And I like the answer to that. It's not just pie in the sky when you die, it's also steak on your plate while you wait. And that means we enjoy the things that God has given us from heaven now, but to share with others. I remember, just to give you one example of this, at our wedding, there was a Dutchman called Kees. And he was just a typical Dutch Calvinist in some ways. And I just couldn't get over it because the background I came from, Christians didn't do this. At our wedding, he was standing at the bar with a big pint of frothy beer and laughing away and singing. I mean, he was old enough to be my father. And I said, Kees, what are you doing? And he was saying, yeah, this is good. God is good, and he has given us all things good, and you are married, and we are so happy, and we rejoice in the Lord, and everything is for God. And the whole bar was listening to him, and I thought, do you know, I quite like that kind of Christianity. Do you know, it's just seeing the goodness that God gives to us. What if I use all my money to help others? Isn't that meaningful and satisfying? Not really. If I give all my money to the poor, says Paul, and yet have not love, it's nothing. Because you could give money and think, I'm extremely virtuous. You know, you could be the kind of person who hands over the mega check. You have the building with your name on it. And yet in the Bible, Jesus says there was a widow came into the temple. She gave a couple of pennies. Treasurer's not going to be happy with that. Except Christ was and God was, because it was all she had to live on. So, yes, you can use your money for good, and you should seek to do so. But just giving money doesn't necessarily mean, again, it's the purpose for which you do things. Okay, I've got a couple of others, but does anyone here want to ask anything? Feel free. Or not. Okay. I'll do one more. It's fascinating, the question about intelligence. Someone was asking about the intelligence and folly, and is it right to say that people, you know, some people are dumb? It doesn't seem very nice, and it's not. So I'm asked to expand that just a little bit. What I mean is this, we're not talking here about academic brilliance. There are people who can be academically very good and thick as bricks in one level. That's not what's been spoken of. What's been spoken of here is the ability to try and understand and to think about things for yourself. And in terms of a dumbed-down society, let me say this. I think it's a profoundly depressing situation in the Western world when in education now we are telling children what to think and we're not teaching them how to think. And it means they can't work things through for themselves. Do you know Google on this thing? Google once had a motto about doing no evil. That's gone. You know, completely gone. But they also had another purpose. They wanted to get rid of memory. Human beings won't need memory anymore. That's incredibly dangerous. Because if you know somebody who suffers from severe dementia, you realize just how important memory is. I'm not saying, by the way, that people who suffer from severe dementia are not human. I'm saying they're humans who are really suffering because a critical part of being human, their memory, has been taken from them, or at least significantly so. And I think that what's happening in our culture is this, and ironically, it's what's associated with religion and religious cults. Oh, they're just brainwashing you. But when you live in a culture where 98% of young people have the same opinion about something, there's something profoundly wrong. I maybe made a mistake. I brought up my children, my two daughters and my son, to ask questions. I shouldn't have done that with my daughters because they can hammer me in arguments, both of them. But in a way, I'm glad. I'm really, really glad to be brought up questioning and thinking. And I think that's what Solomon's saying here. He's saying, let's try and understand things. Let's try and work out, how things work. Let's work out what things are for. Let's work out what our purpose is in life. But he's then saying, but without God, if we do that, we're going to end up nowhere. We're going to end up like someone like Nietzsche, absolutely brilliant mind. And he ends up dying in an insane asylum because he couldn't cope with the stuff that he worked out. So I hope that has been beneficial both for you here and for those of you who are online. It's a real challenge. I find this chapter a real challenge to me. I'm going to ask Rob if he's going to just come up and we'll finish with singing. You're very, very welcome to hang around. Please feel free to take some of these leaflets. Next week, we're going to look at A Time for Everything, the burden of beauty and eternity from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Thank you so much for being here, and please do feel free to hang around and chat afterwards. And if you want to contact me online, feel free to do that. If you want to speak to George or Ruth or anyone else here in the Cathedral, feel free to do that as well. And don't forget, here at the Cathedral, and there are other churches as well, I feel like I'm on radio and advertising Woolworths. There are other stores, but there are other churches as well. Just go to a church that teaches God's word and practices it, and I think you will find Christ. But Rob, what are you going to finish with?
I'll let the song speak for itself. Here we go.
Okay.
Today I watched in silence as people passed me by, and I strained to see if there was something hidden in their eyes. But they all looked back at me as if to say, life just goes on. The old familiar story, told in different ways. Make the most of your own journey, from the cradle to the grave. Somehow this is borrowed because today life just goes on and on. But there's more to this life than living and dying, more than just trying to make it through the day. More to this life, more than these eyes alone can see. And there's more than this life alone can be. Tonight he sits in silence, staring into space, and he looks for ways to make tomorrow better than today. But in the morning light it looks the same. Life just goes on and on. He takes care of his family, takes care of his work. And every Sunday morning as he cycles past the church, somehow he still feels the need to search. But life just goes on and on. Oh, but there's more to this life than living and dying, more than just trying to make it through the day. More to this life, more than these eyes alone can see. And there's more than this life alone can be. So where do we start to find every part of what makes this life complete? If we turn our eyes to Jesus, we'll find end. Life's true beginning is there at the cross where he died. He died to bring us more to this life, the living and dying, more than just trying to make it through that day. More to this life, more than these eyes alone can see. And there's more to this life, the living and dying, more than just trying to make it through that day. More to this life, more than these eyes alone can see. And there's more than this life alone can be. More to this life, more to this life. Thank you very much.
See you next week.